It's a new month, which means I answer questions asked by $3 supporters at Patreon and Subscribestar. $5 supporters can also give me a shout out. So let's look at the questions supporters asked in July, and if you'd like to ask a question for August, the links are below. Let's start on Patreon, where Darth Vega asks, I was watching a Joe Rogan clip where he was claiming that construction codes and regulations are necessary to prevent shoddy construction work that can lead to all sorts of consequences, including deadly ones. What are your thoughts on such regulations? I've done videos on that before. In particular, I made one response to Tom Hartman where he blamed the free market for asbestos, even going so far as to say, quote, capitalism killed one of my best friends. Libertarian capitalism also killed my father and the family of one of my coworkers. And why? Because America is unregulated, unlike Europe, which is regulated. I know, it's laughably insane, but his audience eats up stuff like that. He actually backed up the precautionary principle, which is what regulations like building codes are based on. But as I've also pointed out in several videos, that's fundamentally contradictory. We know that following the precautionary principle has bad side effects. Drug testing is one of them. I've shown before that the FDA, by delaying life-saving medicine from being introduced to the market for the better part of a decade, has killed far more people than it can claim to have saved. Look up the Peltzman effect for another example. And since the precautionary principle has bad side effects, then, by the terms of the precautionary principle, we shouldn't follow the precautionary principle. Getting back to asbestos, not only was it not the case that companies were choosing it because of whatever market forces Hartman thinks were at play, the actual reason it was being used so much is because government building codes required it, according to a report published in the Texas Administrative Law Journal regarding the case Commonwealth v. Johnson Insulation, quote, what neither party brought to the attention of the court, apparently because they did not know it, is that these asbestos-containing products had been installed in compliance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts State Building Code, which specified, approved, and in some types of service required the use of asbestos, not only at the time the products were installed, some of them decades before, but at the time the case was filed. Johnson Insulation was, in effect, being held liable for having complied with state law and regulation. The vast majority of current asbestos claims result from past efforts on the part of defendants to comply with and/or to enable compliance by property owners and building contractors with building codes and engineering standards at the federal, state, and local levels that specified and approved asbestos in code-compliant assemblies. For most of the second half of the 20th century, asbestos was specified, approved, and in some cases required by building codes and engineering standards adopted by municipalities, states, and federal agencies, including the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the U.S. Public Health Service. As an example, the report quotes California's state housing law and building regulations from 1963 requiring quarter-inch asbestos millboard in the kitchens of living units. Compliance with these standards was also required for obtaining the fire insurance necessary for mortgage financing. Until the end of the 20th century, and in some cases beyond, asbestos was specified and approved in code-compliant assemblies in the U.S., Europe, and elsewhere that passed inspections by the authorities having jurisdiction. What the asbestos plaintiff bar now calls safer substitutes, routinely tested from the 1930s forward in both Europe and the United States, did not pass the standard engineering tests required for code compliance. During the same period that asbestos cement pipe was being tested and adopted in the U.S., in the 4 decades between 1930 and 1970, testing, approval, and installation of asbestos cement pipe was progressing in France, Germany, Argentina, Holland, Brazil, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, Hungary, and Sweden, as well as Italy and the UK. So much for Europe being different. Compliance with building laws and other safety regulations as specified in asbestos, including those of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the U.S. Public Health Service, is now construed in asbestos litigation as negligence. In the landmark 1973 Burrell v. Fireboard decision, The Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court in the following year argued that it was the failure to warn that made asbestos-containing materials unreasonably dangerous, relying on the Restatement Second of Torts in 1964, which asserted in Section 402A that a product was unreasonably dangerous if a reasonable man would not sell the product if he knew the risk involved. Yet, no safety authority, including OSHA and USPHS, required warnings on asbestos-containing products or their packages prior to 25 November 1985. We are thus forced to the patently absurd conclusion that the two American regulatory agencies most directly responsible for public health and safety at the federal level specified and approved assemblies before 1985 that were, by this legal logic, unreasonably dangerous, and that the engineers, physicians, and scientists associated with these agencies could not have been reasonable men and women. How can the manufacturing use of approved assemblies that complied with all relevant law and regulation and which were demonstrably not defective at the time of manufacture and/or use with respect to the types of services for which they were intended be construed as negligence? And that one example should be all you need. The problems of asbestos were absolutely 100% the fault of building codes, yet, when it all came out, people blamed the lack of building codes and said we need building codes to solve the problem. No reasonable person should take any such claims seriously after that. Sid Padmanaban asks, many people point to Libya under Gaddafi and Chile under Salvador Allende as examples of working socialism. What are your thoughts on this? Under Allende, Chile underwent a massive redistribution of wealth that, like every single time it's been tried, dramatically increased demand but did nothing to increase production. What do they always end up doing instead? Printing money, which leads to hyperinflation. His rule was plagued by bank runs, capital flight, and massive drops in investment. The industries he nationalized kept prices artificially low, which resulted in shortages. Expropriating the copper mines only made things worse. It just resulted in the price of copper falling by a third. Generally, with socialism, it'll take 10 or 20 years for this effect to play out. Under Allende, it only took 3. The only productivity that grew was the production of banknotes, and inflation soared to 150%. As for Gaddafi, he basically ran a military dictatorship that nationalized oil and other industries. Unemployment went up over 30% and stayed there. What jobs there were didn't pay all that much. The only reason there wasn't more dissent of his leadership was that he actively oppressed it. But the dam broke in 2011 and civil war broke out. Sadly, this was another case where the opportunistic Obama administration decided to intervene militarily, basically saying that we were always at war against East Asia. If that's socialism working, what does it look like when it fails? Venezuela, I guess. Over on Subscribestar, Tomasz Urbański shouts out this video, Anti-AI Art, a Trojan Horse for Mass Internet Surveillance. Basically, UMG and the other usual suspects went to Congress to whine about their art being stolen by AI training. Regular viewers shouldn't need me to debunk that yet again. And they even called for regulations to stop people impersonating the style of an artist, something that cannot be copyrighted. And how do you solve that problem? Mass surveillance. Government loves that because they get to spy on everyone and bypass the Fourth Amendment, and big corporations love that because they can protect their dominance in image, music, and video production. I only skimmed the video, so I can't honestly give it a good recommendation, but check it out and see what you think. Dave Saunders sent his question as a private message on Subscribestar, and while I appreciate it greatly, I just want to point out that this isn't a great way to do it, since Subscribestar does absolutely nothing to notify me when this happens, and I really just came across it at the last minute more or less out of luck. Anyway, he writes, Do you think there were any benefits to the UK being in the EU, or was it just another layer of useless government? Everything about the EU was just bad from the word go. It'd be nice if they were just useless. Check out the history of the podcast for all sorts of horrible things the EU has forced on its member countries. About all you really need to know to confirm that EU membership wasn't any good was that the only reason the news media gave for Brexit was stuff like racism. Whereas if you actually looked at what was going on, you get a much different impression. A good example was to look at Germany and Greece. Before the EU, Germany had a sound money system and the Deutschmark was the currency to beat. They gave that up to adopt the euro when they joined the EU. In Greece, Prime Minister George Papandreou, a student of none other than Richard Wolff, tried to implement his mentor's disastrous social policies, which resulted in the Greek economy tanking and people rioting. But since both countries were now using the same currency, Germany took an economic hit, even though their economic system was a lot more sound. It should be noted that the UK never adopted the euro, keeping the pound, so they were spared a lot of that, but it was still the case that they were left on the hook for a lot of economic idiocy that other EU members were engaging in. You can easily see the horrible trade practices with China, which the EU failed to challenge but was of great concern to the British people. There was a similar issue with Russia, which we're seeing the effects of now. Ukraine wanted a tripartite agreement with the EU and Russia, trade with Russia representing 30% of their economy, but the EU wanted Russia out of the deal. Ukraine wanted to know how the EU was going to make up for that economic loss. Of course, they didn't have a way. The result is the US-backed Euromaidan coup in 2014, which led to the secession of Crimea, and after 8 years of ethnic cleansing of Russians in the Donbass region, ultimately to the current Russo-Ukrainian war. The EU also holds member governments hostage to laws and decisions made by unelected officials or officials in other countries that don't represent their people. So again, the EU being a useless government would have been an improvement over the reality of it. And as we make it halfway through the dog days of summer, thanks so much for watching. Comments for the comment god, shares for the share throne. Please hit like, subscribe, and the bell, and check out other videos on my channel and like and share them to get them above the shadow banning. And go to donate.bogosity.tv for all sorts of ways to donate, including not only PayPal, but also a new Venmo link, as well as all sorts of cryptocurrencies. Thanks again, and until next time, stay strong and be free.